Our speaker today, Nathan Schneider, is a journalist and an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And he's going to explain to us what's happening to traditional public media and how new ownership models might help newspapers survive. Nathan has written or edited books on cooperative business, God, the Occupy movement, and the internet, quite a combination. He has reported for The Nation, Harper's, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, among many other publications. His particular interest is in building an internet of ownership through platform cooperativism. Now, Nathan, by the time you leave, we'll understand what that is, right? We'll try. Nathan has a bi-coastal education. He has a bachelor's degree from Brown University and a master's degree in religious studies from the University of California. Nathan, please come forward.
Thank you so much. And thank you all of you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. Especially as a group of community leaders, I'm going to be talking about an issue that really needs community leadership, which is community journalism, and the kind of relationship that we as a community might have with our institutions of journalism. Anybody remember this? Last April, the Denver Post used its entire weekend editorial page to raise concern about the ownership of that paper. This was a radical move. The editor who led that initiative, who's now in our college, is being honored by the National Press Association. This made national news. The New York Times covered this event the weekend it happened. It was an incredibly radical statement, but one that also echoed around the country as resonant and familiar. One thing that stood out in the statements included in that section was a concern about not only the who of ownership, but the structure of ownership. The journalists called for a kind of ownership that could truly support the kind of journalism that they wanted to be able to do, that they know this community, the Colorado community, needs. And so a group of reporters who had come from the Denver Post got involved in a new project in the subsequent months. It was called the Colorado Sun. Has anybody been reading the Colorado Sun? Just a few of you. This work that I'm going to be presenting today comes out of a collaboration I've been doing with the founders of the Colorado Sun, a really, really interesting, innovative news organization that is starting its innovation with those questions of ownership that were raised in that kind of rebellion in the Denver Post. For instance, when you look at the business card that these folks are handing out, it says journalist owned, ad free. Currently, the paper, the online publication, the Colorado Sun, is 100% journalist owned. It's owned by the people who are reporting the news. That this is important enough that they put it on their business card to them. Second, the Colorado Sun is part of a network called Civil. Now this is where stuff starts getting crazy. Civil is part of uses the Ethereum blockchain, which is based on technology related to Bitcoin. Any Bitcoin holders? Not that kind of crowd. Nevertheless, this is built on a model that you don't have to understand Bitcoin in order to start to get, through which consumers of news would have a hand in owning and governing not just a single news entity, but a whole network of news organizations that consumers would be involved in paying for news, as well as helping to determine what counts as news, how news should be done, what counts as fake news. And they've been devising a really, really interesting governance system for a global kind of economy of governance for the future of news. Thirdly, the Colorado Sun is actually the first online publication to be allowed membership in the Associated Press. Really interesting moment, and we'll come back to the significance of that a bit later. Now, the things that they're doing here, each of those things I just described, is in some respects very new, especially in our region, but is also drawing on older models. So as part of my work with the Colorado Sun, I've been exploring these older models and helping them understand what they might be able to learn from that. And the kind of overall framing I've been using for this is broad-based stakeholder ownership. Stakeholder ownership means that one or more classes of people who are instrumentally involved in the business are the owners of it. So this is kind of distinct from investor ownership, where people are owners who are mostly interested in a financial return, who may not be day-to-day involved as consumers or producers of that news or any other kind of business. This same term can apply. Broad-based means that rather than simply being a kind of executive compensation plan, a kind of elite ownership, that ownership is spread widely across the organization, across whatever the relevant classes are. And this term is used, for instance, in other kinds of employee ownership discourses to distinguish, again, an executive stock bonus plan from, a fully employee-owned company, something like that. Okay? And this kind of model seems to have particular promise in the industry surrounding journalism. First, journalism is an incredibly trust-oriented business. Trust is incredibly important. We see that right now in the kind of crisis of trust that is developing in our political moment now, right? And so it's imperative that media institutions are able to establish and retain trust. This broad-based ownership could be a way of doing that. Professionalism before profit seek, right? Where professionalism is able to have a kind of autonomy and a hold in an organization. We see many of the complaints arising out of newspapers across the country is that professionalism is being eroded for the sake of investor returns. And then connected to both of these is accountability. To whom are these publications accountable? When I think of what accountability means, I lie awake at night worrying about stuff a lot. Accountability is who you're worrying about when you're lying awake worrying. Think about that. Who are you worrying about when you're lying awake pondering how you're going to make a certain decision the next morning? Okay. But does this kind of model work? I'm going to review a couple of examples of how this kind of thing has been tried. One is in employee ownership. This is, in some respects, the most widespread example. And employee ownership in newspapers started coming about quite early. One early example notched here is the Horace Greeley's, after whom Greeley, Colorado is named, Herald Tribune, which New York Tribune, which was in addition to having a profit sharing program for its employees, was a kind of promulgator of British cooperative business models in the United States, and that's partly why Greeley, Colorado, which was founded as an agricultural prohibitionist commune, was named after Horace Greeley by its founder, the paper's former agricultural editor. But then other papers started finding ways of involving employees in ownership. And this was appealing on the one hand as just a means of securing kind of appropriate local control, also as a succession plan. It was a means of avoiding the sometimes onerous inheritance taxes that one might encounter by passing a paper along to descendants. That selling to employees became a kind of useful financial tax strategy. But this approach really took off with Louis Kelso. Anybody heard of this guy? He was a double buff, we call him. You know, he did his undergrad in our business school at CU and his law degree there as well. Got out of Colorado as quickly as he could after that, unfortunately. Went to the Bay Area and was obsessed, even back to his college days, with the possibility of broadening capitalism, of broadening ownership. He was, with Mortimer Adler, co-authored a book called The Capitalist Manifesto that was very seriously reviewed in Pravda in the Soviet Union, as the kind of ultimate statement of American capitalism. But he was really interested in a very radical idea of broadening stock ownership much, much more widely in order to expand wealth and wealth creation. And his first really practical experiment, as he was in the employee stock ownership model that he was exploring, was the Penninsula Papers company, which owned several papers in the Bay Area. And this was a successful experiment. Actually, our former chair of the journalism department got his start working for one of these papers, and he then continued advocating. By the 1970s and 80s, this ESOP model, these employee stock ownership plans, were incorporated into the tax code, making it much easier for people to build employee-owned businesses. And excuse me, I kind of gave away the ending. But after this, a pretty substantial number of papers across the country started converting to employee ownership. This legal structure facilitated this conversion, made it much easier, much more kind of tax beneficial, and so forth. And during this time, you see in the early reports some very positive feelings about how this was going. However, this model has not stood the test of the digital turn. I think I'm still investigating exactly why, but my strongest hunch is that the capital reserves allowed by the specifics of how these models were designed were insufficient to deal with the crisis of new digital media, and there are a few that remain. Some are diversified. Some are just only very partially employee-owned, and as this structure was constituted, it did not enable these publications to weather the pressures that they came under. So this is a kind of cautionary tale, but it also points to how enabling legislation can make possible models that others that previously were viewed as attractive, but were not as streamlined, as easy to accept. Another model of this kind of broad-based ownership I think is really important and often under-noticed today is association ownership. We heard from about the Daily Camera earlier. Part of what, good portion of the bulk of the Daily Camera every day comes from the Associated Press. And this is one organization that can claim, for instance, alongside Facebook and I don't know how many other publications, not very many, to reach billions of people every day. The Associated Press was formed as a cooperative of New York newspapers in the 1840s and continues to operate in that fashion, especially having weathered several court cases and decisions that actually compelled it to operate more cooperatively, particularly a 1945 Supreme Court case. And interestingly, this is not simply a matter of kind of an empty market. This has been a highly, this role of wire services has been a highly competitive market throughout Associated Press's history. But this cooperative model of ownership by local papers has been incredibly resilient. And of course, we see it around the world, and in some of the major press agencies are organized this way. It appears to be an incredibly important and valuable tool for supporting local and especially smaller scale journalism. And this shouldn't come as a surprise. The same goes for instance, the hardware industry. You know, our beloved McGuckin, you know, down the road is able to compete with Home Depot because it's a member of Ace Hardware and is able to benefit from that joint purchasing. This is a model that was also used in the early days of radio with a mutual broadcasting system. I actually first learned about this because I was looking through old photographs of my grandfather, who was actually a director of a purchasing co-op in the hardware business as well in the 70s and 80s, and there was a picture of him standing in front of a microphone, a radio microphone that said mutual. And I thought, what is that? And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of this mutual broadcasting system that was a vital element and actually is now regarded as a precursor of the public radio system. Even though at the time it was very commercial cooperative model. So this kind of example and the power of these kinds of models, the way in which like nobody is worrying about fake news coming from the Associated Press, right? Or highly polarized coverage coming from the Associated Press, and that's a result of its ownership structure. It's an organization that is owned by, say, the New York Times and Fox News. And that cooperative relationship means that it has to hold a space that is increasingly being vacated by other publications. That ownership structure enables it to do what others might have trouble doing. A third model I want to consider, which has been less practiced in the United States, is audience ownership, because there's a growing interest in this kind of model. When I talk to and am approached by publications across the country that are looking to explore more broad-based ownership strategies, this is often more what they're interested in. There is some precedent. So for instance, in the upper Midwest, and actually I've been finding some examples among the towns formed with under New Deal policies in the 1930s, like Greenbelt, Maryland, for instance. We see farmers' consumer cooperatives and producer cooperatives kind of developing, spinning out newspaper cooperatives. So this is a cooperative that's who's got a couple papers still running in Wisconsin that was formed during a farmers' strike, right? And so there's a bit of precedent, but this is fairly marginal. This model is starting to take some new life now with a model called, it's an older legal structure that's kind of being revived, called direct public offering, that enables companies to offer shares to the general public without just turning to accredited investors under certain terms. This is being used by several papers in the Bay Area. There's a lot of interest in this kind of public offering model as a strategy for financing a business, but also financing it through the people who are going to be its best customers, its audience. And so this direct public offering strategy is beginning to take hold. This is an experiment coming out, kind of first experiment coming out of something called the Banyan Project, which is trying to replicate locally owned news organizations across the country, being developed by a veteran journalist who's been working on a range of, working on this project for a good number of years now, and they're just launching the first publication in Massachusetts. And this is a model that goes back. This has been little used in the U.S., but there are actually some interesting precedents. Ever wonder why the Green Bay Packers are still in Green Bay after, San Diego just lost its football team? That goes back to this story that in the 1920s, the team started selling shares to the local community with a poison pill built in. If you sell the thing, it's all the money's going to go to charity. And that has created a kind of loyalty, trust with the team, and also helped ground it in the community in firmer ways. And actually, even though this has been made illegal by the NFL, so other teams can't do this now, however much they might like. In the UK, this kind of model under the name community shares has been spreading and has been very successful for football clubs, soccer clubs. And actually one of the leading people who's been involved in doing that in the UK, consultant there, has turned to media as the new opportunity zone for this kind of model of community share ownership. And so several UK publications are starting to adopt this model coming from sports. And actually, I was involved in a campaign that used this example to talk about Twitter. And we actually submitted a shareholder proposal to Twitter, got it, heard and voted on, got a pretty decent vote at the Twitter annual meeting to consider this kind of model for distributed user ownership for online platforms, all going back to this 1920s stock sale from the Green Bay Packers. We're in a moment where these questions of ownership matter in new ways. For instance, this is another of those crazy blockchain projects, using the underlying technology of Bitcoin, actually developing a web browser that pays you for the advertisements that you see, that makes you a kind of co-owner of your own attention. And this is the kind of technology and new thinking that I think we need in a moment where our attention is in a sense the new oil. They say data is the new oil, and that data is us. How is that data being owned and governed? These are questions that are tied intimately with the future of news and the future of accountable information networks. Now, the road along this way is bumpy. That Project Civil that the Colorado Sun is associated with had a great deal of trouble in its first effort to raise funds, and a lot of the other publications are experiencing some rocky times. The Sun was not banking too much on this the crypto side of the model, so it seems to be affected less. We can also consider really bringing some of the strategies of the digital economy into a new model for news organizations. This is a proposal from a French media scholar who has proposed kind of integrating a bunch of different aspects from crowdfunding to actually features of university structures, a range of things, piling in a new kind of journalism organization. And I think this is really important to consider, to recognize that throughout our history, we have been willing to see journalism as distinct. Going back to very early American history, the use of a postal subsidy to enable journalism to happen more affordably. That these efforts that are experimental and entrepreneurial may not be enough on their own, and that we need to think as a community, as a public, about what kind of models we want to enable, what kind of models we want to empower. I don't think it's enough to simply trust that the market as it is established is going to be sufficient to create the next generation of journalism that we need, any more than it appeared the case decades and centuries ago in the print era. So we need to continue this conversation, not only about which publications we like, who's fake news and who's not, but the conversation about what kind of structures we want to actively enable to make our news accountable and trustworthy, professional in the ways that our communities need. Thank you very much. This is the book I'm not allowed to sell, and that's on cooperative models more generally that I just published. And I would be very, very happy to take any questions or comments that you all might have. Thank you so much for your attention.
I'll just stop out there. It would be interesting to me. I mean, one of the issues that I see right now in our society is that there are so many different outlets, and people pick their own what they're going to listen to or read or whatever. And when I look at the user ownership model, doesn't that just kind of propagate the problem to some degree, that we all just be kind of we just read what we want to hear? I'd just like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Does that kind of direct user ownership create conditions for more polarization, say? I think that's a really valid point, and that's why I think no one of these models is sufficient, and that's why I've been looking at multiple approaches. I think, for instance, blending that kind of audience ownership with association ownership introduces a kind of diversity into the ecosystem that could be really interesting. So thank you for that.
I have a question. When we're looking at public figures that will say something that, even though they know it's not true, but they say it often enough that people start to believe it, and then you start looking at the credibility and the utilization of the press to help hold accountable those individuals that are doing these practices, and you're looking at the way in which this whole landscape is changing. Do you have a favorite model that you would recommend, or what can we as consumers be really attentive to check out our next?
Thank you. There's a media scholar who has argued recently that maybe our problem is we have too much media literacy. This is kind of terrifying for those of us whose job is apparently media literacy. But I think it's an interesting argument that we do have major accountability problems in our current media. And I think that's being exploited for political purposes, exaggerated. But it's built on the basis of people being told over and over for years and years that, how many fingers do you need to count the major media owners in this country? How consolidated is this? How tied up is our news media with interests that aren't necessarily the common, aligned with the common good? And I think there's a respect in which we need to approach this question about in terms of the kinds of accountabilities we need. And so I don't come out of this with a particular answer of a model that we should embrace. I think to have an interesting media landscape, you want a diversity of models. But I think what the underlying concern about anything that we're doing should be, how can we make sure that that accountability is where it needs to be? And when we're talking about private enterprise, the best way to ensure, to know where your accountability lies is through ownership. So I hope that we can become a kind of artists of ownership in thinking about the future of media.
Nathan, thank you so much for your preparation for today's presentation. And I'm sure we could have talked a lot longer about question and answers. But as a former newspaper editor myself in college, I have a great appreciation for what newspapers do to educate us and connect us. And in your honor today, the Boulder Rotary Club is pleased to contribute 100 doses of vaccine to the Polio Plus Fund. Thank you again.
very much.